So part 3 is the second occurrence of a night section. Read the first paragraph of chapter 7 and write a short response for me on why you think the night sections repeat throughout the novel. I've sort of already spoilt this one. The night is mine, my own time, to do with as I will, as long as I am quiet, as long as I don't move, as long as I lie still. The difference between lie and lay. Lay is always passive. Even men used to say, "I'd like to get laid," though sometimes they said, "I'd like to lay her." All this is pure speculation. I don't really know what men used to say. I had only their words for it. I lie then, inside the room, under the plaster eye in the ceiling, behind the white curtains, between the sheets, neatly as they, and step outside, sideways, out of my own time. Out of time. Though this is time, nor am I out of it. But the night is my time out. Where should I go? We've already briefly mentioned the idea of the narrative having many analeptic shifts and flashbacks that we have to piece together like a mosaic. One of the reasons for this is revealed at the end of the novel. It's got an important and poignant thematic relevance relating to the theme of oppression of women. The male historian transcribes over Offred's tale and thus renders it a palimpsest. The night sections are her therapeutic mental escapism for Offred. She at one stage thinks that she needs to resist too much of that for risk of her mental health before really embracing the idea of a companionship. She needs to retell what she has witnessed, to tell her truth, as opposed to Pieixoto's concept of historic accuracy of document that removes that emotive element. And so it's during these musings on the time before, particularly the use of language not being restricted in the time before, that she evidences her educated background. We've already mentioned her nostalgia for phrases from the time before, which in Gilead are strictly prescribed through quasi-falsely scriptural language use. She describes her pleasure in dwelling on the ambiguities of prior phrases, and she uses the metaphor for that of them being litanies, which has an ironic double meaning here, because litanies, usually in Catholicism, are traditionally religious recitals of language. Here, she might be deliberately using the religious term to be dismissive of it. Here, this repetition of language from the time before and its multiple possible meanings when ambiguity was allowed gives her solace from the religious fundamentalism that she suffers under for a time of greater freedom of expression. So this might seem strange, but one of these litanies is where Offred internally debates the terms lay and lie. So I'm going to ask you, as previously, to hit pause and take a long pause here to consider the different variations and meanings of these words, including less formal slang applications of them. Challenge yourself for a hefty number of them. There are loads. We often grammatically incorrectly use the word lay when we mean lie. Think about the other more negative connotations it might have. How might these be representative of Offred's situation and characterisation? Hit pause for me in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So you might be quite surprised by the number of dictionary definitions that this may have. Lie. To be in or assume a horizontal or resting position on a supporting surface. The body lay face downwards on the grass. I lie down. Of a thing to rest flat on a surface. Of a dead person to be buried in a particular place. The body lies in a crypt. A book lay open on a table. Notice that lay is something being passively done to something. Snow Patrol song Chasing Cars, for example, is grammatically incorrect, much as I love to sing along with its chorus. If I lay here, if I just lay here, is grammatically incorrect. It should be if I lie here, if I just lie here, because it's in the first person active voice. Otherwise, a book is laid on a table. A book lay open. The body lies in a crypt. To be, remain, or be kept in a specific state. The abbey lies in ruins. The solution lies in a return to traditional values. Of a place, to be situated in a specific position or direction. Kexby lies about 5 miles due east of York. Of a scene, extend from the observer's viewpoint in a specified direction. Stand here and all of Amsterdam lies before you. Of a competitor or team, to be in a specified position during a competition. United are currently lying in 5th place. In the law, of an action, charge or claim, to be admissible or sustainable. An action or restitution would lie for money paid in breach of the law. I'm going into huge detail here about a million possible examples of definitions, but this is the kind of thing that the educated Offred indulges in as a inward resistance to the indoctrination of the regime. The noun lie, the way, direction or position in which something lies, the position in which a golf ball comes to rest. An altogether different connotation of the word lie, and this is why English is often so difficult for people to learn, is the way that the same word can have such different meanings. Lie, to tell an intentionally false statement. They hint rather than tell outright lies. Used with reference to a situation involving deception or founded on mistaken impression. All their married life she had been living a lie. Gosh, that's an example and a half. To tell a lie or lies. To get oneself out or into a situation by lying. So we have here lying, actively lying down horizontally. Being laid, something passively lying down. A deliberate deception, to tell a lie. And some of the sexual and slang connotations that go along with this. Lay, where we might have had lie used as noun and verb, there are several verb forms here. Lay in the third person present, lays, laid, laid, laying. To put something down gently or carefully. To present something from rising off the ground. To put down and set in position for use. To set the cutlery and the crockery. to cover a surface with objects, to put materials for a fire in place and arrange it, to prepare a trap for somebody, to work out an idea in detail, ready for use or presentation, to locate in a particular place, to stake an amount in a bet, used with an abstract noun so that the phrase formed has the same meaning as the verb relating to the noun used, to lay the blame on somebody, of a female bird, insect, reptile, amphibian, to produce an egg from inside the body. In vulgar colloquial slang, to get laid, to have sex with somebody. An act or instance of having sex. Offred speculates about whether men sexually objectified women lustfully by saying something like, "I'd like to lay her." In the Urban Dictionary, getting laid means having casual sex with somebody, or non-casual sex with somebody that you don't really care for. You would never say you got laid by somebody, because there's this derogatory connotation to it of dismissively not caring, having a one-night stand rather than a long-term meaningful relationship. It's just sex. Equally, it can have quite aggressive connotations, to lay into or lay somebody out, to physically attack them or deliver a knockout punch. So on a basic level, Offred asserts that the night is one of the few freedoms that she gets. It's mine, she asserts, my own time to do with as I will, internally. As long as I'm quiet. As long as I don't move. As long as I lie still. That use of the repetitive clause start as long as, which, if this were poetry, we could refer to as anaphora, but that's more a verse feature than something that we'd use in prose analysis, really serves to emphasise that this is very little in the face of such restriction. The difference between lay and lie. Lay is always passive, the prior misogyny of the time before. I'd like to get laid, I'd like to lay her, alludes to the kind of lustful objectification of women in men's eyes that Lydia and the other aunts would term anarchy. This is pure speculation, she says. She doesn't know what men used to say. She lies under the plaster eye in the ceiling where the chandelier used to be. We might infer that this is something to do with the idea of a suicide by the prior handmaid. But the eye motif recurs again for constant surveillance. Not literally, it's not a camera, but it conveys her paranoia that she can only internally rebel whilst in the dark of her bedroom at night. Where should I go? In her mind. This is mental escapism for her. It's therapeutic. She goes somewhere good. Moira, somebody who would have had the gumption, she hopes, against this regime. Sitting on the edge of my bed, legs crossed, ankle on knee, in purple overalls, one dangly earring, the punk style of the 80s. One gold fingernail she wore to be eccentric. A cigarette between her stubby, yellow-ended fingers. Let's go for a beer. You're getting ashes in my bed. If you'd make it, you wouldn't have this problem, said Moira. In half an hour, I said. I had a paper due the next day. What was it? Psychology? English? Economics? We studied things like that then, when women were allowed to study. On the floor of the room there were books, open face down, this way and that, extravagantly. The adverb of extravagantly for the way that they're laid doesn't seem to fit. A set of books in a room is not extravagant, but it's a freedom and luxury that is worlds away from her existence now. "Now," said Moira, she's assertive. "You don't need to paint your face, it's only me. What's your paper on?" "I just did one on date rape." "Date rape?" I said. "You're so trendy. Sounds like some kind of dessert. Date rape." "Ha ha," said Moira. "Get your coat." She got it herself and tossed it at me. "I'm borrowing 5 books off you, okay?" She's assertive. She gets her way. And then we get a further analeptic shift further back in time to Offred's remembrance of childhood and her mother's parallel feminism. Or in a park somewhere, another place that she could go back to in her mind with my mother. How old was I? It was cold. Our breath came out in front of us. There were no leaves on the trees, grey sky, 2 ducks in the pond, disconsolate. Breadcrumbs under my fingers, in my pocket. That's it. She said we were going to feed the ducks. But there were some women burning books. That's what she was really there for. There's a resentment of her mother. To see her friends. She'd lied to me. Saturdays were supposed to be my day. I turned away from her, sulking toward the ducks, but the fire drew me back. There were some men, too, among the women, and the books were magazines. They must have poured gasoline because the flames shot high, and then they began dumping the magazines from boxes. Not too many at a time. Some of them were chanting. Onlookers gathered. Their faces were happy, ecstatic almost. Fire can do that. Even my mother's face, usually pale, thinnish, looked ruddy and cheerful, like a Christmas card. And there was another woman, large, with a soot smear down her cheek and an orange knitted cap. I remember her. "You want to throw one on, honey?" she said. How old was I? "Good riddance to bad rubbish," she said, chuckling. "Is it okay?" she said to my mother. "If she wants to," my mother said. She had a way of talking about me to others as if I couldn't hear. The woman handed me one of the magazines. It had a pretty woman on it with no clothes on, hanging from the ceiling by a chain wound round her hands. I looked at it with interest. It didn't frighten me. I thought she was swinging like Tarzan from a vine on the TV. "Don't let her see it," said my mother. "Here," she said to me. "Toss it in, quick." I threw the magazine into the flames. It riffled open in the wind of its burning. Big flakes of paper came loose, sailed in the air, still on fire. Parts of women's bodies turned to black ash in the air before my eyes. But what happens? What happens then? I know I lost time. She is anxious about the accuracy of her memories, and we have to cope with piecing together this non-chronological set of analeptic shifts. There must have been needles, pills, something like that. I couldn't have lost that much time without help. "You've had a shock," they said. I would come up through a roaring and confusion like surf boiling. I can remember feeling quite calm. I can remember screaming. It felt like screaming, though it may only have been a whisper. "Where is she? What have you done with her?" There was no night or day, only a flickering. After a while there were chairs again, and a bed, and after that a window. She's in good hands, they said, with people who are fit. You are unfit. But you want what's best for her, don't you? Her daughter. They showed me a picture of her, standing outside on a lawn. Face a closed oval. Her light hair pulled back tight behind her head. Holding her hand was a woman I didn't know. She was only as tall as the woman's elbow. You killed her, I said. She looked like an angel, solemn, compact, made of air. She was wearing a dress I'd never seen, white and down to the ground. Is she an unreliable narrator, or do we see through her self-denial here the kind of reliability that she does have? I would like to believe this is a story I'm telling. I need to believe it. I must believe it. Shows her awareness that she knows it's not fiction, but that she wishes it was. Those who can believe that such stories are only stories have a better chance of mentally coping, of survival, of not committing suicide. If it's a story I'm telling, then I have control, something she doesn't have, over the ending or outcome. Then there'll be an ending to the fiction, to the story, and real life will come after it. I can pick up where I left off. No such luck. It isn't a story I'm telling. It's also a story I'm telling in my head as I go along. She asserts it's not a story, but that it's a coping mechanism. For me, she is reliable. Tell rather than write, because I have nothing to write with, and writing is, in any case, forbidden. But if it's a story, even in my head, I must be telling it to someone. You is an ambiguous pronoun, it's indefinite. It could be anybody listening. It could be an innate desire for any kind of companionship and communication. Definitely something that you can parallel with Frankenstein, the desire to communicate as being a facet of humanity, his need for language to be understood. The creature, that is. Here, her desire for any kind of listener to retell her testimony, her truth, her story, or more precisely, a desire for the you that is Luke, her prior husband, her current husband, who may or may not be dead in the escape attempt. We've not heard about the escape attempt yet. That will be another analeptic shift that we put in as a jigsaw piece a little later. You don't tell a story only to yourself. There's always someone else, even when there is no one. A story is like a letter. Dear you, I'll say. Just you, without a name. Attaching a name attaches you to the world of fact, which is riskier, more hazardous. Who knows what the chances are out there of survival? Yours. Could be Luke, or an imaginary friend. I will say you. You, like an old love song. You can mean more than one. You can mean thousands. I'm not in any immediate danger. She wants to reassure her husband. I'll say you. I'll pretend you can hear me. But it's no good. because I know you can't. She's shifting from rationing her thoughts, as she put it, for survival earlier, to engaging with the idea of a companion. And later she says, I believe you into being, possibly thinking that Luke is still alive. I think, therefore you are, is a play on the philosopher Descartes' I think, therefore I am. But I'll come to that as and when it becomes analytically relevant in future episodes. I'm very deliberately repeating this quotation because I think it's so key. I try not to think too much. Like other things now, thought must be rationed. I've already spoken about the way that Offred goes on to change her tone. Here she's resisting too much indulgence in nostalgic memories of the time before in case it sends her crazy or mad. However, these sections are her mental escape. Later, she is speaking to an ambiguous you, in some hope of communication, companionship, audience, whether it be a collective listener or the hope that her husband has survived. Note the semantic field here as well of rationing thought, conveying this concept of austerity. I know what you mean, we'd say, or a quaint expression you sometimes hear from older people, I hear where you're coming from, as if the voice itself were a traveller arriving from a distant place. Again, I'm deliberately repeating this. She, almost tongue-in-cheek, is sarcastic about calling this quaint because it's from the time before. She's emotionally protecting herself with humour here. She doesn't consider it quaint. She would love to be back in a world where she had the freedom of expression to actually need to read between the lines instead of this totally unambiguous, browbeaten loyalty to regime, outwardly being compliant when she really inwardly rebels, albeit so restricted that it can be on only the very smallest of scales. Offred likes to remember her former life. She recalls her college friend Moira, by college here I mean university level, and remembers going to a park with her mother as a child. So we get various analeptic shifts that go so far back in time and then further still before returning to the near present of Gilead. She remembers going to a park with her mother as a child where she saw people burning pornographic magazines. She's forgotten a chunk of time, and she speculates that that might be as a result of being drugged by the authorities. She remembers waking and screaming for her daughter, at which time the authorities told her that she was unfit and that her daughter was with those fit to care for her. They show a photograph of her daughter wearing a white dress. She's been handed over to a wife and is holding the hand of a strange woman. She recounts these events, and as she does so, she imagines that she's telling her story to somebody else, whether a generic reader or listener, or possibly husband. This chapter gives an indication that Offred might not be a reliable narrator. What details suggest that? And do you consider her unreliable or not? So this concept of narrative reliability is really important. And in the past, when I've set this task to some of my students, I've found them perhaps a little bit too great an extent emphasising Offred as being potentially unreliable. I tend to reach the conclusion that she shows a self-awareness that is reliable. This might be something that you find more meaningfully productive if you are comparing with Frankenstein, because there are evident sections in which Victor Frankenstein's story alongside the other narrators shows his lack of self-awareness. When Atwood was asked to explain what actually happens in The Handmaid's Tale, she replied that there might be several truths. And later down the episodes, I'm going to get you, if you want to do a written response, it depends what you think is useful to you, to at least consider the concept of Offred as an unreliable narrator. Who in this tale do we trust, and why? This becomes a more poignant question when we see the perhaps derogatory and dismissive attitude of P.X. Soto at the very end. I personally think that Offred's self-awareness, whereby she draws careful distinctions between Gileadian language and the time before, and later on her honesty about recounting multiple versions of certain things, such as her encounters with Nick, and implying some of her awareness of her emotional motivations, certainly assures me as a reader that she's reliable, even in the wake of having been subjected to indoctrination and brainwashing by the totalitarian regime. But we'll cover this much more meaningfully later when we look at some sections whereby she lures us down a certain path and then says, actually it didn't happen quite that way, here's what happened. And then she'll do it again, and she shows us what it means to be human, what her emotional motivations are for this need to witness and retell, sometimes in a couple of ways, for the sake of her emotional needs. So you'll find me warning from time to time that this may or may not be relevant to you depending on what course you are following. Most of the prose elements of A-levels in the UK require 2 novels of 2 different centuries to be compared. I don't think that any other course beyond the one I teach prescribes it alongside Frankenstein. If it's useful to you, great. If it's not, sit tight and it won't be terribly long, or do a little bit of a skip. I can't tell you a timestamp right now, and ideally it's not great for me algorithmically on YouTube. Just sit tight and it won't be long. How does this reliability concept mirror the narrative style of Frankenstein? We've got multiple narrators, each with their own motives for telling the story, and each with potential bias. We seem to have something like a diary, but is actually recorded cassette tapes from our narrator Offred throughout. It's only when we get to the historical notes at the very end that we learn that that has been usurped, taken over by a male historian who may have muddled the agenda or the order of things, and thus the semantics could be changed. Again, who do we trust and why? In the Frankenstein text, we have Walton at the beginning in the Arctic, who is the meta-diegetic narrative. He is on the outside of things, apparently lending an external objectivity to the whole story. He's part of this box narrative, the meta-diegetic level. Within that, we have Victor Frankenstein's extra-diegetic narrative layer, which appears by comparison with the creature's narrative later on to be unreliable in terms of his lack of self-awareness, particularly of the creature's initially benevolent intentions. And within that, trapped, is the creature's intradiegetic layer, meta extra, intra. So, whom is it that we actually end up trusting? Is Victor sufficiently self-aware? Is the creature trapped within the other two framing narratives? Is Walton adding that independent objectivity, or is he swayed by loyalty for Frankenstein? I don't necessarily want you to do this in great detail. You're busy people who will be getting homework from your teachers. And I want to do this in more meaningful detail for Handmaids a bit further down the line. But you may wish to plan a response outlining the comparatively unreliable narrators in both novels. It's a good technical comparative way to go. Give reasons why you may or may not consider them reliable or believe what they tell us. You might be sceptical about Frankenstein. You might sympathise with the creature only to a degree. You might raise concerns about Offred's reliability, but find evidence that she seems of sound mind despite indoctrination. Continuing with this concept of narrative reliability, have you ever played the game with your mates or a group that you're getting to know early on, whereby each of you comes up with 3 statements about yourself, 2 of which are true and 1 is false? And when you state them, everybody else has got to take votes and guesstimate which is the lie. How is it that you go about guessing those lies? Is there, for instance, more elaboration that betrays which were the lies? And is it the lies that tell us more about the person's motive or desires, how they want to come over or come across? And I think perhaps it's that concept of those motivations that makes us look at the aspects where Offred retells certain aspects of her tale 2 or 3 times. It's been reconstructed by the historian anyway, but when she does it herself, she lets us know that she's done it. For me, that still seems reliable and is talking about her emotional needs, despite having been indoctrinated, brainwashed. I consider her reliable, because otherwise she needn't have let us know that there were such ambiguities. I would like to believe this is a story I'm telling. I need to believe it. I must believe it. Those who can believe that such stories are only stories have a better chance. If it's a story I'm telling, then I have control over the ending. Then there will be an ending to the story, and real life will come after it. I can pick up where I left off. It isn't a story I'm telling. It's also a story I'm telling in my head as I go along. Tell rather than write, because I have nothing to write with, and writing is in any case forbidden. But if it's a story, even in my head, I must be telling it to someone. You don't tell a story to yourself. There's always someone else. So emotionally, she would like to believe that this horrific experience, this horrible regime, is a fiction so that she can get out of it. That may be a mental coping mechanism for her. Story connotes fiction rather than reality, as opposed to testimony being actuality in terms of its connotations. She hopes that by believing it a story, a fiction, she has a better chance of long-term mentally coping. She thinks that if she thinks of it as a story, she can manipulate through hope some sort of positive outcome. She can pick up. She hopes to make it her story as opposed to a historic testimony over which she has no control of the outcome. But in a new paragraph, in a drop to a new line, in a short clause, she asserts cynically, it's not a story. She tells it, it's oratory, it's oral, because she is so restricted, she's forbidden from writing. But either way, this must be an action that has an audience. Anybody in desperation, or, more specifically, the hope for her husband's survival. Early on, she's rationed thought of prior times to stay sane. Now she pretends her life must be unreal to maintain sanity. Later, she allows herself to witness and retell the actualities of her life to a you. That pronoun is incredibly important in this novel, which could be her desire for her husband, or more generally, an imagined reader or listener. And I draw that distinction of listener because of the historic notes. These words suggest that Offred is not recounting these from afar. She's not looking back at a period that's too much earlier. Rather, she's recounting daily horrors as she experiences them. Hence why I think that she's still in hiding when recording these. This telling becomes a rebellion against her society. Gilead seeks to silence women, but she speaks out, even if only to an imagined listener, or reader, or Luke, or God. Gilead denies women control over their lives, but Offred's creation of a story, making it sound like fiction, gives her control over the ending. It's her hope when she has no foresight of the outcome. Her creation of a narrative gives hope for the future, that there'll be an ending, that real life will come again. She can hope that somebody will hear this story, or perhaps someday she will tell it to Luke. She's found the only avenue of rebellion available to her in this totalitarian society. She denies Gilead control over her inner life. She's not been indoctrinated. Perhaps I'm placing too repetitive an emphasis on this, but I think it's terribly important thematically. Bear with me if it's getting frustrating. When we discover in the historical notes that the novel is actually a fictional historian's transcription of cassette tapes, discovered in what is at least effectively an archaeological dig, we infer Offred is at least partially escaped, if only into hiding within the borders of Gilead, hence the disguised tapes and the lack of writing materials. In a continuation of the theme of oppression of women, Soto transcribes Offred's tale, thus making it a palimpsest. He's written over her story with an agenda of accuracy that renders it history. Note the male patriarchal pronoun. We will explore the significance of Soto's name toward the end of the course. It's actually a Portuguese name from a Brazilian South American novel. But for now, let's note that this occupation with avoiding moral judgment of Gilead's society, something that he emphasises fictionally, is actually contrary to what I consider part of Atwood's core message here. To write over history, or render it a palimpsest, is to forget it, and thus risk repetition of historic mistakes in regard to oppression or totalitarianism. For instance, could somebody, somewhere, have resisted Nazism? Certainly not as an individual, but potentially as a society. Do we allow controls that we ought to see being a slippery slope? So here we are, all the way in chapter 7, And if I were to ask at this stage who is Offred, we probably don't know a great deal. She's the narrator, she's the most significant character in the novel, she's the handmaid telling this tale. We experience the Gileadian society through her eyes, but in terms of what we actually know about her, not very much at all because of the extent to which she's been oppressed. She has viable ovaries, which have kept her safe, but her expiration date is looming. She's got one more chance. We know something of her relationships in the time before. We know some of her wants and desires on a very small scale. And we know that she faces this new world in a way that sometimes, even though it seems like small little rebellions might be reckless, at other times seems terrified. We don't know her real name. I have another name, which nobody uses now because it's forbidden. I tell myself it doesn't matter. It's like a telephone number, only useful to others. But of course it is important emotionally. I have trouble remembering what I used to look like. We've already done some close analysis of chapter 7, so I'm not going to go into that to too great an extent again. But chapter 7 is where we've learnt about Moira, the sassy militant feminist, who was mentioned when whispered bed to bed, and when Offred desires to meet with her, when being careful with trusting Offglen, she says, Offred, that it's just to know that she, Moira, still exists. She's the novel's most outspoken feminist. Who's the other? And how is feminism important to the novel? Our other key feminist is Offred's mother, who actually doesn't get named. She's a single mother by choice. She has first wave feminist friends who are against relationships with men, but Offred's mother wanted a child, even at 37, which at that time would definitely have been considered, and still is now considered, what's known as a geriatric pregnancy, a pregnancy that might bring with it more biological complications. She was lonely, but her dismissive attitude of men is to do the job of insemination and then bugger off. I make a decent salary and I can afford daycare. I think Offred in her former life is quite dismissive of her mother's feminist cause, perhaps considering that attitude perhaps selfish. Does a child need more than one parent in an ideal household to be raised? So this concept of a kind of binary opposition between Moira and between Offred and her mother crops up. And we see some core differences in the types of feminism of her mother and Moira. Both, though, seem to have an authority of sorts over Offred. With Moira, it's a matter of personality, whereas with her mother, it's perhaps just naturally age and relationship. Both mother and Moira are rebels. They have a lack of conventional femininity that might be one aspect of that, but both rebel against their surrounding societies in a more profound way. I need to correct myself a little there. I refer to Offred's mother as being part of first wave feminism, which isn't really relevant. First wave feminism would have been the suffragette movement and a much earlier part of the 20th century. Perhaps we should say that Offred's mother is at least second, arguably third wave feminism. And I think that ties up with some of Offred's cynicism or resentment of her mother. The idea of core feminist values or battles already being won, and having a cynicism about the need for further feminist action, when actually her comfortable life in the 80s onwards shifts to something whereby that freedom is usurped and taken away from women yet again. A final thought for today, which could be a practice essay question for later, but is just a thinking point for now. If you are simply looking at this for handmaids, how does Atwood present females and femininity in the novel? Moira, Offred's mother, Offred, Offglen, Serena. Or, if you are looking at a comparative of this with Frankenstein, how do the novels present females and femininity in both, whilst also linking to relevant contextual factors, which we'll come to in greater detail as we move on. Feminism being a core one. How do those Handmaid's characters compare and contrast with Elizabeth, Agatha, Justine, or Sapphi? If you are sticking with things as long as this, please like and subscribe. Really helpful to me. Hit the notification bell and you'll get forthcoming episodes alerted to you. Thanks ever so much, and I will see you soon.